My brother announced at Thanksgiving, "I'm buying Mom and Dad's house for $1." They already agreed. I was the one who'd paid the mortgage for 12 years. I smiled. Congratulations. 2 days later, I received the transfer paperwork. I didn't sign. Instead, I called my lawyer when my brother showed up with a moving truck. The sheriff was already there with papers that said, "My name is Kieran. I'm 41 years old, and I drive a taxi for a living." I know what that sounds like, and I don't care. I've had 12 years to stop caring. What I need to tell you about is a Thanksgiving dinner, a sentence my brother said between the sweet potato casserole and the pie, and the moment I understood that everything I had quietly built for my family was about to be handed to someone who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve it, I smiled. I said congratulations, and then I went home, sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for a long time, and made a phone call that changed everything. But let me back up first. I grew up in Maple Crest, which sounds like a subdivision name and basically is. It's the kind of place that sits between two larger cities and never quite figured out what it wanted to be. Strip malls and church parking lots and a high school that had a pretty good football team in 1987 and has been coasting on that reputation for 30 years since. The houses on our street were close together, close enough that you could hear the neighbors arguing through the bathroom wall if the TV wasn't on, and it was usually on. My parents, Walt and Lorraine, had 3 children. Me, my brother Colton, who is 3 years younger, and my sister Finley, who is 7 years younger than me and arrived in the family like a small bomb that everyone adored immediately. Let me tell you about the family hierarchy because it's important and because I want to be precise about it. I don't think my parents sat down and decided to treat us differently. I genuinely don't believe there was a meeting where my dad said, "All right, Kieran's the one we're going to overlook." That's not how it works. How it works is much quieter and much harder to argue with because there's nothing to point to. It's accumulation. It's 1,000 tiny moments that don't individually seem like anything, but when you put them in a row and stand back and look, the shape they make is unmistakable. Colton was the funny one. He had this gift, he still has it, of making any room he walked into feel like a party that had been waiting for him to arrive. My dad lit up around Colton in a way he never lit up around me. They'd sit on the back porch together and laugh at things I couldn't hear from inside, and when I'd come out, the laughing would die down just slightly, not mean, just resetting. Like I was a different kind of visitor. Finley was the youngest and the only girl, and my mother treated her like a project she'd finally gotten right. She had dance recitals every 6 weeks. We attended all of them. When Finley got a call back for a community theater production at 14, my mom cried actual tears in the parking lot on the way home. Good tears. Proud tears. I was the oldest. I was quiet. I got decent grades, not spectacular enough to create excitement. I didn't play sports. I didn't perform. I did things like clean out the gutters when they were clogged and make sure the youngest 2 got to school on time when my parents were running late, which was often. I was the kid who noticed when the milk was almost empty and put it on the grocery list. No one puts that in a toast at Thanksgiving. Here are a few specific memories offered without editorial comment. When I was 16, I got a part-time job at an auto parts store and saved up for 6 months to buy myself a used bike. I was proud of it. My dad looked at it in the driveway and said, "That's sensible." When Colton, 3 years later, used money my mother lent him to buy a moped, my dad called 3 different relatives to tell them about it. My high school graduation ceremony was attended by my parents and no one else. Finley wasn't born yet. Colton had a Little League game that same afternoon, and my parents left my ceremony slightly early to make sure they got there in time for his second inning. I want to be fair. They stayed for my diploma. They left during the next kid's name. When I was 22 and told my mother I'd been hired as a full-time taxi driver, had my license, had my car lease, had my plan, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, it's steady work." When Colton, at 24, announced he'd gotten a job managing a bar downtown, she called it his big break and made his favorite dinner. None of these things individually would hold up in court. That's the thing about them. That's exactly the thing. After I left Maple Crest, I built something small and functional and mine. I live in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building called the Carlton, which sounds much fancier than it is. It has a broken elevator that gets fixed roughly every 18 months, and a landlord named Beaumont who communicates almost entirely by handwritten notes left under the door. I like it. I've been there 8 years. My apartment has one specific detail that I think tells you everything. I have a wall of city maps, not decorative. Actual maps, pinned up, some of them marked with routes I've learned or adjusted over time. Visitors always look at the wall first and then at me in a way that says they're recalibrating something. I have a dog named Colonel. He is a 7-year-old beagle mix who is deeply, professionally committed to being underfoot at all times. He sleeps on the left side of the bed and has strong opinions about which of my regular passengers smell interesting. He is the best animal that has ever lived, and I will not be taking questions on this. My real support system is small but solid. My best friend is a guy named Briggs, who I met 11 years ago when we were both stuck in the same terrible apartment building that had an actual functioning elevator but mold in every bathroom. Briggs is a mechanic and has the specific gift of knowing when to talk and when to show up with food and say nothing. That's rarer than people realize. My supervisor at the taxi company is a woman named Sloan. Sharp, efficient, always wearing the same style of dark blazer, gives credit where it's due in a voice like she's reading a report. The first time she said, "Kieran's one of our best, and I want that on the record," I had to pretend I needed to check something in my bag. And there's Naomi. I don't want to make this about Naomi in the way that makes it seem like she fixed me, because she didn't, and she'd be the first to say so. But she's been in my life for 4 years, and she is the kind of person who pays attention in the way that makes you realize you've been living your whole life around people who weren't paying attention. She noticed I went quiet around my family. She noticed it long before I did. I still drove to Maple Crest regularly. Holidays, of course, but also random Sundays. My mom's birthday, my dad's back surgery recovery. Colton's thing when he needed help moving furniture, twice. Finley's thing when she needed help. I showed up. I always showed up. I'm not saying this so you'll think I'm a good person. I'm saying it because it's part of the pattern, and you need to understand the pattern. Now here's the part that I realize I should have explained first, and I'll explain why I didn't in a second. 12 years ago, my parents were going to lose the house. This isn't dramatic. It's just what happened. My dad had been laid off, my mom had some medical bills, the mortgage had gotten behind in the way that things get behind when there's no buffer, and then one bad thing happens, and then another. The number was specific. They were 4 months behind, plus penalties, and the bank was sending letters. I had savings. Not a lot. I was 29 and driving a taxi, not a hedge fund manager. But I had savings because I had always, my entire life, been the kid who saved things. I paid the arrears. All of it. And then, because we sat down and did the math and it was the only thing that made sense, I kept paying. I became, in practice if not on paper, the person who covered the mortgage on my parents' house every month for 12 years. I want to be precise. It was $974 a month. I know this number in the way you know your own phone number, in the way you know certain things so well they stop feeling like information and start feeling like weather. 12 years, give or take a couple of months here and there. I've done the math. You can do it too. I didn't ask for my name on the deed. That was an oversight on my part that I have spent some time thinking about, and I've arrived at a very clear-eyed conclusion. I didn't ask because I trusted my parents, and because I genuinely wasn't doing it as an investment. I was doing it because it was necessary, and because I could, and because that is what I do. I am, and have always been, the one who notices when the milk is almost empty. My parents knew. Colton knew. Finley knew. It wasn't a secret. It was just never made official. It was just what Kieran did, the way Kieran always did things. Here's the moment the invisible dynamic became visible to me. I was at my parents' house about 3 years ago, a Sunday in March, and my mother was telling me about a conversation she'd had with Colton's girlfriend at the time. I was washing dishes, because someone had to, and I was the one who noticed. And my mother said, from the couch, "Colton's so generous. Did you know he bought them dinner last week? Just out of nowhere." She said it the way people say things they think the other person will simply enjoy. Like information she was sharing because she assumed I'd agree. Colton, so generous. Bought them dinner. I stood at the sink with my hands in the water, and I thought about the $974, and I thought about the 12 years, and I thought about how generous was a word my mother had apparently never once associated with me. And I put that thought somewhere careful, and I finished the dishes, and I drove home. And I told Colonel about it, and he licked my hand, and we moved on. I told myself it was fine. I was wrong. The dinner was at my parents' house. 22 people, which is how Lorraine prefers it. The more the better, she says. And what she means is the louder the better, the more distraction the better. The more people there are, the more impossible it becomes for any one person to have a real conversation with any other person. The turkey was good. The gravy was from a jar, which is a family tradition we all pretend we don't know. Colton stood up after the main plates were cleared, before the pie came out, which is the classic speech move in our family. He's 38 years old, and he still has the face of someone who expects to be cheered. He tapped his glass. "I have an announcement," he said. The table settled. My mother was already smiling. She knew I understood later. My father was looking at his hands. Colton said, "I'm buying Mom and Dad's house for $1. They've already agreed, and we're going to make it official before the new year." Here is what happened in my body in the next 4 seconds. First, nothing. Complete stillness. Then a sound in my ears like tuning a radio to static. Then a very specific thought, which was, the mortgage is paid off in 8 months. I'd been counting. I had 8 months left, and then the house would be free and clear, and something would finally be finished. I looked at my mother. She was beaming. She looked at Colton the way she always looked at Colton, like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life. My dad raised his glass. People applauded. Literally applauded. I looked at Naomi, who was sitting next to me, and she looked at me, and her face did something very quiet and controlled that told me she was also doing the math, and that she was going to let me lead this, and she would be there exactly however I needed her. I turned back to the table. I raised my glass. "Congratulations," I said. "That's great news." "I mean that." I said it in a normal voice. And I had another piece of turkey, and I waited for the pie, and I drove us home in silence. And when we got inside, I sat on the edge of the bed, and Colonel put his head on my knee, and I sat there for a very long time. "Kieran," Naomi said. "I know," I said. She sat next to me and put her hand on my back. She didn't say anything else. That was the right thing. 2 days later, I received an email with a PDF attached. Transfer paperwork. My parents' names, Colton's name, a purchase price of $1, and a line that said, "Signature of current financial guarantor required for lien release." They needed my signature, because without my signature acknowledging that I was releasing any financial interest, the title company wouldn't complete the transfer. Someone, somewhere in that chain, had done their job correctly and flagged that the mortgage payments had been coming from me for 12 years. So they needed me. They just hadn't thought to tell me that before the announcement at Thanksgiving, before the applause. I read the email twice. I set my phone face down on my kitchen counter. I made coffee. I drank half of it. Then I picked the phone back up and I called a lawyer whose name Briggs had given me 2 years ago, after a fender bender, who I'd never used, whose card I'd kept in my wallet in the way you keep things you hope you'll never need, but suspect someday you will. Her name was Adira. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her the situation in about 90 seconds. "I'm a taxi driver. I'm good at summarizing information efficiently." There was a pause on her end. "You've been paying the mortgage for 12 years, she said. "Yes." "Do you have records of the payments? Bank statements going back to the beginning?" Another pause, shorter. "Don't sign anything," she said. "Don't respond to the email. Come in tomorrow at 10. I made an appointment." I texted Briggs, "I need you to sit with me tonight." He showed up 40 minutes later with a 6-pack and a bag of chips and asked no questions for the first 2 hours, which is exactly what I needed. "So what are you going to do?" he asked, eventually. "I'm going to find out what I'm entitled to," I said. He nodded. He handed me another beer. "Good," he said. That was all. Here's what I didn't know, because I am a taxi driver and not a property lawyer. Equitable interest is a real thing. It means that even without your name on a deed, if you can demonstrate sustained financial contribution to a property, mortgage payments, maintenance, property taxes, any of it, you may have a legal claim to a share of that property's value. It's not automatic. It's not simple, but it is real, and it is documented. And I had 12 years of bank statements and the original wire transfer receipts from when I paid the arrears. The house, by the way, had gone up significantly in value. The neighborhood had gentrified quietly over the past decade. What my parents owed when I started paying was roughly $140,000. The current market value was somewhere around $310,000. Colton was about to acquire a $310,000 asset for $1 and a toast at Thanksgiving. Adira filed a notice of equitable interest on the property. This meant that the title couldn't be transferred without resolving my claim first. When Colton showed up with a moving truck on a Tuesday morning in December, apparently my parents had been planning to gift him the house and move to my aunt's property in Florida. There was a sheriff's deputy waiting on the driveway with a court order enjoining the transfer pending a legal hearing. I was not there for this. I was driving a fare to the airport. Briggs told me about it later because Colton had called him, apparently thinking Briggs would somehow be helpful. Colton was very upset. This is not something I feel guilty about. My mother called me that afternoon. Her first words were, "What have you done?" I said, "I've protected 12 years of my contributions to that property." "That was a gift," she said. "We thought you were helping because you wanted to." "I did want to," I said. "That doesn't mean it stops being 12 years of payments." She made a sound I'd heard before, the particular sound of someone who is genuinely confused by the existence of consequences, like a person who has never dropped something discovering gravity. "We just thought you'd be happy for Colton," she said. I told her I loved her because I do. I told her I'd be in touch through Adira going forward. And I hung up. I stopped calling. I stopped driving to Maple Crest on random Sundays. I stopped being available in the quiet, ambient way I had always been available. The first call they'd make, the person who noticed, the one who just handled things. I want to be honest about how this felt, because people assume it felt powerful, like a movie moment. It didn't. It felt like setting down something very heavy that you'd been carrying for so long you'd forgotten it was weight. It felt like my arms aching in a way they hadn't ached before, because the muscles had been in constant use, and now they were unused and they didn't know what to do with themselves. I waited. 22 days. I counted. 22 days of silence before my phone rang, and it was my dad's number and my dad's voice, which almost never called me for non-logistical reasons. "Hey, bud," he said, which is what he said when he needed something. He used to call Colton Bud, too. He called Finley sweetheart. He called me Bud only in specific circumstances. The specific thing he needed. My parents had planned to refinance a small loan against the house to help with the Florida move, and the bank had flagged the pending legal action and frozen everything. He wanted to know if I could maybe talk to that lawyer and see if we can just wrap this up. "I'm not going to do that, Dad," I said. He was quiet. "I'm not being difficult," I said. "I'm just not going to do that. Your mother's very upset," he said. "I know," I said. "I understand that." We stayed on the phone for a few more seconds, which felt like longer. And then he said he'd let me know if anything changed, and we said goodbye. I drove my next shift. A woman in the back seat was on the phone with her sister making plans for Christmas, and she laughed at something her sister said, and it was a completely ordinary sound that I found myself listening to very carefully the whole way to her destination. The legal process took several months. A few things happened in the rest of my life during that time that I want to tell you about. Sloan called me into her office in January. She gets to the point immediately, which I respect. "I want to put you in the senior driver coordination role. Pay bump. You're training new people, managing route assignments. I've been watching how you handle things. I want your brain in this." A few months in, she said in front of 3 people in the break room, "Kieran's done in 3 months what I couldn't get done in a year." I want that acknowledged. I looked at the coffee machine. My face did something I couldn't control. My therapist is Dr. Leland. Small office, enormous coffee mug that says, "World's okayest therapist." She wears reading glasses, she pushes up when she's listening, and pulls down when she's about to say something important. The glasses came down 6 weeks in. I'd been explaining the family situation the way you explain something you've organized into a presentation. Tight, efficient. "Doctor," Leland said, "you're not grieving the loss of your family. You're grieving the family you wanted that never existed. You weren't just covering the mortgage. You were buying your place in a family that was always going to give the house to someone else. Some part of you knew. You just couldn't say it." I sat with that. Then I said, "That's accurate." And then, quietly, briefly, I cried. The kind that happens when something you've been holding correctly for a long time finally gets put down. Briggs showed up that February with a 6-pack, our shorthand for "I'm here, no explanation needed." We watched a documentary about bridges. I spent the whole time thinking about structural load. Briggs knew that. Naomi came home after a late shift and left dinner on the stove, just pasta and a sticky note on the counter. "You don't have to earn this." 4 words. She was already asleep. I read it twice and put it in the drawer where I keep things I want to keep.